Hi there, good afternoon, everyone. My name is McKenna Sturgeon. I'm just doing your quick intro. I am CML's Training and Marketing Specialist. I'd like to welcome you to our first installment of CML's Housing Webinar Series 2022. Today we're focusing on how Colorado is making investments in housing. We're joined by Kathy Alderman of Colorado Coalition for the Homeless and Brian Rosbert of Housing Colorado. And just so everyone knows, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view later. So for those of you new to GoToWebinar, just a quick rundown, you should see a control panel to the right of your screen. This is where you can go ahead and ask questions. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll be answering those at the end of the webinar. So with that, I will turn it over to our Legislative Advocacy Manager, Megan Dollar, to get us started.
Thank you, McKenna. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. This is a really, really important topic, and I'm so excited to have our two presenters here. You are going to hear directly from the chair of the Affordable Housing Transformational Task Force subpanel, Brian Rosbert, who is the executive director of Housing Colorado, an organization that CML has partnered with frequently on legislation and publications as well. And so you're going to hear a lot from him. Additionally, you're also going to hear from the vice chair of the Affordable Housing Transformational Task Force subpanel. These are all very long titles. Kathy Alderman, who is the who is the Chief Communications and Public Policy Officer. I wanted to make sure I got your title right. With the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. Again, a really important organization in the housing space. These two individuals spent multiple hours over the interim working diligently with the members of the housing subpanel, as well as legislators, identifying housing priorities for American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and even some additional things to be thinking about going forward outside of this as well. So I want to thank them for being here today. I appreciate you both taking the time to come speak with us, and please go ahead and take it away.
Sure, thanks, Megan, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I feel like this has been kind of the road show for the last couple of months, talking about what we were up to with the Affordable Housing Transformational Task Force subpanel. Yes, it is a tongue twister, and a lot of time and energy went into it, not only on Kathy and my behalf, but also from the subpanel members as well as the task force itself. I'm just going to hop right in and sort of just give kind of the quick overview of where we were at, and then Kathy's going to get into what the recommendations were coming out of the task force, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of what the input and what the output looked like. Just to get you situated, here's a list of the task force members. It was a bipartisan makeup of both legislators and then executive branch appointees, which was really an important, I think, part of how this task force operated, was that there were practitioners at the table helping to make decisions on how $400 million was going to be spent for housing. And so we had a switch over midstream of the chair of the task force, former Representative Dominique Jackson, left the legislature to go take a job at HUD. And so Representative Roberts stepped up and led the task force through its completion. But you know, we had really good engagement, I think, from all sides throughout this process. McKenna, you could go to the next slide. The subpanel that Megan mentioned was really made up of, again, a diverse set of interests and a diverse set of people who represented the housing industry and represented interests in those who are interested in housing as a part of their organizational identity. And so you can see here a list of those folks, everyone from you know, for-profit developers to nonprofit organizations, housing authorities, everything in between. These members of the subpanel were appointed from both sides of the aisle in both chambers of the General Assembly. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, McKenna. So where did our work begin is a question that I'd like to start with. So there was $3.8 billion that came to the state in the form of the American Rescue Plan Act. And House Bill 2113-29 allocated $550 million of that to address housing issues in the state. The first chunk of that money went out the door to Division of Housing and the Eviction Legal Defense Fund. And then what was left over was $400 million for a legislative task force or not a legislative task force, a task force to meet in the interim to really work on, and I think the quotes are important here, policies to create transformative change in the area of housing using money the state receives from ARPA. And so that was really our charge, was to look at not just funding opportunities that already exist out there, but to really invest in transformative change. One quick note on these funds, they have to be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and then spent by December 31st, 2026. And so there's kind of a short time frame. I know that 2026 seems far off, but I'm hardly able to believe that it's March of 2022 next week. So you know, things are moving fast. These funds will take some time to get out the door, but we have some time restraint on them. We can go ahead and go to the next page. Lots of text here, but it's important to identify what the allowable uses of these ARPA dollars were. So they could be used for services to address homelessness, affordable housing development, housing vouchers, a long list of things. But there was also some guardrails put on the allowable uses. One, serving populations, households, or geographic areas disproportionately impacted by COVID. And we talked a lot about this at the subpanel and talked to the task force about this guardrail in particular, that the need to be addressing populations or households or geographic areas, this disproportionately impacted by COVID requirement, in some ways limits where the funds can go. And so in the recommendations that the subpanel made, we were really cognizant of this fact. There at the bottom, the third part of the list there really gets at how you determine whether or not it responds, the service or program responds to the COVID requirements. And what we learned through this process is that we didn't necessarily have to identify specific households, but that communities could be identified for the use of these funds. So it didn't have to go to, say, you know, the Smith family over in Park Hill, but if there was a way to identify the community that household belonged to, that was an eligible use of these funds. We can go to the next page. Some level setting that we did at the very beginning of our process at the subpanel was to identify some strategic priorities that were undergirded by this priority for funds to be used for disproportionately affected communities. We talked about expanding capacity, so really talking about how we build more housing, but also how we expand the capacity of organizations on the ground to be able to do the same. To do that was a part of our conversation and one of the priorities we named. We talked about stabilizing existing affordable housing. We know that we need to build more housing, but we also know that a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing is being converted into market rate. And so stabilizing the existing affordable housing was a key priority for us as well. We also talked about and made a priority of strengthening the safety net. It's one thing to get folks housed, it's another thing to keep folks housed. And so strengthening the safety net was definitely important. And then something that really was a through line for all of the priorities and all of the work that we did was to ensure access and equity in the way these funds went out the door. And so that was kind of always top of mind in our conversations, was how to ensure equity and access for all folks. We can go to the next slide.
Hey, Brian, before we go to the next slide, can we ask a quick question really quick?
Sure.
How is affordable housing defined?
That is the next slide.
Perfect. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure that we got that cleared up.
Sure. So we did some work as a subpanel and as a task force to really set this definition, to talk about the full continuum of housing needs, from folks experiencing homelessness to those experiencing or entering home ownership for the first time. Affordability is tied to people, not the market. So what that means is that we're really thinking about this next bullet point, that folks shouldn't have to spend more than 30% of their income on housing and housing related costs. That was the baseline definition for us in terms of what is affordable, was that that goal of getting to a place where folks aren't spending more than that part of their income on housing. And in the state, according to one report from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, it's estimated that a quarter of our state's population spends more than 50% of their income on housing. And so what happens when you do that is you are at risk of being destabilized in not only your housing, but in all aspects of your life. You may not be able to afford medicine or food if you are spending that much more on your housing. And so that's kind of the baseline definition. We talked about AMI standards should be responsive to the community, and this really gets at some of the ways in which housing is built. Utilizing federal programs has AMI, or area median income, requirements tied to it that aren't always responsive to the community in which housing is trying to be built. So for instance, in some of our mountain communities, folks making 120 or 150% of the area median income aren't able to afford housing in their community. And so we really wanted to come up with some solutions that were responsive to the community needs and in which they were placed, and not always tied to those AMI standards. And so if we had some one-time money to think about some new opportunities for investment. And finally, we're really clear that affordability should be long-term, that we should utilize tools that ensure that this housing that we're hoping to create or preserve is affordable into the foreseeable future, and that it doesn't convert to market rate necessarily really quickly. So that's kind of the level setting, the context in which we're operating. So we operated within those definitions, with those strategic priorities, with those groups of individuals, and the subpanel made 11 funding recommendations to the task force. And Kathy's going to get into how those funding recommendations sort of made their way out in terms of the report that the task force issued to the General Assembly. But, suffice it to say, there was a lot of work and time and energy that went into those recommendations. And, I think Kathy and I were both really thankful for the time and energy that our sub panel put into making those a reality. And, it was 14 meetings of the sub panel. It was, I think we lost track of the meetings with the task force, 5 or 6 meetings with the task force, and lots of conversations in between that really helped us get to this place of making funding recommendations. And we also, and Kathy will get into this, really wanted to take this opportunity to examine some longer term policy change as well. We thought that this was a good opportunity while we were having a conversation about affordable housing and actually having resources to dedicate to it, to make some policy change as well. And like I said, Kathy will hit on some of those policy recommendations and where some of those already stand in terms of the legislative session that began on January 12th. So I'll hand it over to Kathy to talk funding recommendations and policy recommendations and kind of where we're at next steps.
Thanks, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today. It's great to have so many people be interested in the work that Brian and I spent so much time doing with our subpanel and the task force over the last few months. And I'm going to walk through, these are the funding recommendations that came from the task force. So just by way of process, as Brian mentioned, the subpanel came up with funding recommendations, many of which are included here, and presented those to the task force. And then the task force took them and kind of merged some of them together and moved them around. And these are the final ones that appeared in the final task force report, which we can provide the link to if people have not been able to see it. But essentially what we really as a subpanel decided that we knew there needed to be 2 major vehicles for getting these dollars out. We needed an opportunity for folks to receive low interest rate, below market loans, as well as direct grants. And so the first funding recommendation that was accepted by the task force and revised a bit was to provide at least $150 million for a revolving loan fund. And this was to address both new and existing capacity. So that means for development of new units as well as preservation of current naturally occurring affordable housing. These loans could also serve as gap financing, meaning that there may be shovel-ready projects that just need a little bit of money to get them over the finish line. Also to help stabilize current homeowners or renters in units that exist today, and making sure that we're addressing green energy standards and sustainable living, making sure that that's kind of a priority that's given for those projects that would receive these loans. The key part of the revolving loan fund is that it would hopefully serve to get the dollars out pretty quickly, but also serve as a vehicle for the state to get money back so that we can continue to invest in affordable housing down the road. There is some question about the alignment of this particular structure with the federal guidance that was released the week that this final report came out. And so I think that's what some of our legislative partners right now are trying to figure out is exactly how this loan fund would operate. But it would likely be administered by the Division of Housing. It would be available to nonprofit developers, other developers. I think the idea is that for local communities, this is the time right now to start getting ready to apply for these funds, which will likely be coming available in the summer after legislative session, maybe early fall. The second vehicle of how we wanted to get the dollars out was direct grants. So not anything that needed to be payback, something that would be direct capital to organizations for many of the same purposes, but we recognize that in putting some of these really complicated projects together, especially for nonprofit developers and maybe some local governments, grants are the only way that it's going to work, because there are no other sources of capital for those organizations to tap into. And when we're talking about building out capacity or operations for some of the organizations that will get some of these programs off the ground, that one-time funding needs to just fund that type of operation, and then the organization can move on, and there's no sense in trying to get them to pay that money back. And again, very similar projects and ways that this funding can go out for affordable housing development. And when we're talking about affordable housing development, we're also talking about it across the spectrum. So for permanent supportive housing, all the way up to first-time home ownership opportunities, and including the preservation of current units. So again, another kind of focus on making sure that these dollars are made prioritized for green energy development or anything that would, meet environmental standards. The next area where there was direct funding kind of allocated was for resident-owned communities, mobile home parks, and land banking. And this is really to make an investment in, one, preserving some of the naturally occurring affordable housing that we have today in mobile home parks, but also to purchase land for future development, and making sure that, because land right now is one of the most expensive parts of the development, and so if we can get ahead and get some assets to the state for development down the road, the task force felt like this would be a good investment of anywhere from 35 to 51 million. The next two that I'm going to talk about were items that were identified by the subpanel to the task force as priorities. The task force indicated that these were priorities. However, they didn't allocate direct funding to them for a couple of reasons. And so I'll talk about them individually. The first one was property conversion for transitional long-term housing. They wanted to make sure that the public understood that this type of property conversion was a priority and something that the task force believed we should be investing in. However, they thought that, one, that this type of development would be eligible for the revolving loan fund and nonprofit and local grants. And there was some ideas that additional funds might be available through the Economic Recovery and Relief Cash Fund. And so some of those details are still being worked out. But I think what's important to note is that we heard a lot, well, why did this get zeroed out? And the intent is not that money will not be going for property conversion, but rather it's an eligible use of the loans and grants, and there may be some additional funding sources for it. You can go to the next slide. Sorry, there you go. The second one that was similar to property conversion was permanent supportive housing and supportive services fund. And again, the task force left this in there to identify it as a priority, but also wanted to take into account that there may be other funding sources and efforts out for these two efforts. And so in the event that a nonprofit developer or another developer wants to develop permanent supportive housing and needs supportive services funding for the operations of that permanent supportive housing and applies to Division of Housing for grants and/or loans, then supportive services are an eligible use of those two initial buckets of funding. There are a couple of efforts the state is engaged in identifying some supportive services funding on a long-term basis, and some additional ARPA funds that have become available for supportive services. And then the Behavioral Health Transformational Task Force, which met alongside of the Affordable Housing Transformational Task Force, has also allocated some funding for supportive services, though we recognize that not all supportive services are behavioral health services. And as I mentioned, the governor has made some requests for homelessness resolution funds from the Economic Recovery and Relief Task Force. And so I think the task force felt like these areas are going to get funded. They are currently eligible uses for the grants and loans, but we want to specifically call them out because they are priority areas, especially for homelessness resolution. The next area where the task force made some direct funding allocations was in modular housing. This was also identified by the governor as a priority. I will say that the task force actually allocated more to this particular area than the subpanel recommended, but I think there's some real opportunities to get more development more quickly and available to folks if we are able to, if we're really able to smartly invest in modular housing, or some people refer to it as manufactured housing. And then the final category was to invest some money in CHAFA's Missing Middle Access Program, which was also a priority identified by the governor, and provide some opportunities for first-time home buyers. Next slide. So part of our work, and I think Brian will agree, we really, when we were setting our strategic priorities, we really started diving into some really intense policy discussions. And at the time, the Chair Jackson asked us to kind of hold off on policy conversations and really get them some specific funding recommendations, but that we should revisit all of our policy ideas. And so after we presented the funding recommendations, we really went back to the policy ideas that had been discussed. And we were able to reach consensus on these 6 items, and I'll walk through them. And then we also provided the task force with a list of items that we were unable to reach consensus on, but that we had very robust conversations on. And we either ran out of time, or we just realized that, you know, that body wasn't going to be able to make any specific policy recommendations, but we wanted to, as Brian says, oftentimes to show our work, not leave anything off the table, so that folks could pick those ideas up and take them on as potential policy and policies or legislation down the road. But the ones that we did reach consensus on, the first was to expand the state tax credit program. That is currently underway with a bill by Senator Zenzinger and Representative Byrd. And obviously we're all in full support of that. The second policy idea is to establish a standing or interim committee or task force on housing and homelessness. This is kind of broad because it could take several forms, but we thought it would be a really good idea to have an assigned body that could track these ARPA expenditures, and that could also help to review and shape housing policy moving forward. I think the recommendation itself is that this could look like a standing committee of the legislature, or it could look something like a standing interim committee that meets regularly and has some authority to bring legislation. But we just thought it was really important to have a body of legislators that cared about housing, meeting with experts in the field, you know, pretty regularly, both to make sure that these expenditures are going where they need to go, as well as shaping housing policy for the future of Colorado, because we all know that we're not going to solve the full housing crisis in Colorado with the expenditure of this $400 million. And so what we really need is investment and long-term policy solutions that are continually responsive to the crisis that we're in. The third was to provide funding to the Division of Housing to update and expand a statewide housing needs assessment. And this is really to make sure that the Division of Housing, who's going to be administering a lot of these funds, is setting some specific goals and is tracking progress towards those goals. And if you're involved in housing policy, you may remember that in 2021, we passed House Bill 1028, which does require annual reporting by Division of Housing, and this is really meant to align with that. But perhaps asking Division of Housing to set up a dashboard where people can easily see what kinds of developments are being funded with these ARPA dollars, what kind of funds are being leveraged by them, what kind of partnerships, both private and public, are being created, and to make sure that we're, again, setting some measurable goals towards addressing the housing crisis. The fourth item was to ensure sustainable funding for supportive services and integration with affordable housing. And this is, as I was saying, this is really intended to say, we know that supportive services have far too long been underfunded in the state of Colorado and across the country, frankly, and that we need a sustainable, ongoing funding source that that non-clinical providers can tap into to provide services like housing navigation, community resources, family support, vocational services, some of the, again, those kind of non-clinical supportive services that we know are really critical in keeping people housed, especially people that are coming out of a situation of homelessness or are at severe risk of becoming homeless. We had really long conversations about the short-term rental market and its impact on housing, especially in our mountain and rural communities, and that this, regulation of the short-term rental market needed to be under consideration. There was, a lot of different ideas about what that could look like, but there is currently a legislative oversight committee on tax policy that is taking a look at it, and so I think what we said to the task force as a subpanel is we need to get really serious about next steps in short-term rental regulation, because it really is having a huge impact on our housing market. And while we may not be the exact body to make the recommendation today about what that should look like, we think that this tax policy legislative oversight committee is the right body, and so we support the work that it does. And then finally, we did reach consensus on the state needing to have a statewide homelessness prevention and resolution, both strategy and funding source. And then it must take into account, it can't just be a one size fits all. It must take into account community needs, because we know that homelessness looks different across our state. I just wanted to mention, and we didn't put it on a slide here, that we did, as I said before, we had several items that were not what we've referred to as non-consensus items, but that we really thought, members of the General Assembly and the public should know about, because we talked about them at length and they could become policy ideas. We just weren't able to reach consensus. And the first was a study of state and local factors impacting the development of affordable housing. And this was really intended to be kind of a one-time survey of all local ordinance, zoning laws, best practices, to really identify, what's working in housing development at the local level and what's hindering the ability to develop affordable housing. And I think just based on the potential outcome of what a study like this could create, we weren't really able to get to consensus, but we wanted to make sure that folks knew that we thought this was something that we may need across the state. Other items were statewide contractor licensing and land use policy. Frankly, we just didn't really have time to dive into that, nor did we have all the necessary experts at the table. We talked about first rights of refusals for renters and nonprofits for expiring properties or properties that are going up for sale that could be converted to market rate, and instead using first right of refusals a way to keep those properties affordable. Looking at ways to do better data and systems integration to make sure that all of our public data is transparent and makes sense. We also talked about some different workforce housing programs that could incentivize employers to be engaged in the affordable housing for their workforce, but also making sure that affordable housing developments provide some workforce opportunities. Construction defect laws certainly came up. Again, I think we realized as a subpanel that this is a conversation that's been taking place in lots of spaces, but does still serve as a frustrating factor for many developers in the state of Colorado. Prioritizing ideas around land banking and land trusts, and making sure that the state's being really smart about those particular strategies for long-term affordability. And then looking at how and when intergovernmental agreements may serve, again, as a barrier to certain communities and getting affordable housing developments off the ground. Next slide. So what's next? Obviously, many of you know the legislative session has started. The members of the task force are working with leadership right now to figure out how these recommendations get turned into legislation. I think there's some question about, do we write one big omnibus bill that deals with all the funding recommendations? Do we need separate pieces of legislation for each individual recommendation? And as I mentioned, the federal guidance that came out 1 week after the report came out, all of these funds have to be spent and distributed in ways that are consistent with that federal guidance. And so a review of that is taking place. But we will likely see legislation and hopefully the coming weeks that seeks to implement these recommendations. So how can you, be involved in that? Obviously, I mean, we would encourage you to take a look at the report. We want to make sure that the recommendations as kind of agreed on by the task force and subpanel really are implemented through legislation that is clear and understandable, but also flexible enough that, projects can get off the ground quickly, the dollars get out the door fast, and that we really, use this once in a lifetime opportunity for spending in our around our housing crisis effectively. As these bills come before committees and likely through either appropriations or the Joint Budget Committee, we would certainly encourage folks to testify in support of, especially the ones that most align with the work that you're doing. I guess, we'll see in the coming weeks what that looks like, but we're certainly happy to provide any additional background information about the work that the subpanel did to get us to this point, and how we think it might be moving forward. And I think that was our last slide.
Yep, I think we're ready for questions.
Great. Let me pull those up. All right, so our first question asks, can you use ARPA funds for land acquisition for affordable housing?
Yes. Yes, and and that was definitely a recommendation that we made, was to utilize this especially for land banking opportunities where land could be acquired and maybe held in trust until it can be developed on.
And I'll just add to that, as Brian mentioned, it's a good question because you have to spend the dollars in ways that address issues for communities that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. It's a little difficult, I think, to make the case to say that we need to do land banking to resolve issues created by COVID. So I think that it would probably be part of a long-term project that's perhaps looking to address workforce issues where you can demonstrate there was a disproportionate impact of COVID because people lost their jobs, and because they lost their jobs, they lost their homes, and there weren't opportunities for them to find other homes because the market was so limited. So again, it's going to be up to the developers, the nonprofit organizations, and local governments to make the case to Division of Housing for why their particular project is addressing an issue created by COVID, or is seeking to alleviate some of the disproportionate impacts on certain communities that we know have traditionally had a lot of barriers to accessing affordable housing, and COVID made that worse.
Awesome, thank you. Next question asks, what qualifies as developing affordable housing? Do things like prep work or partnership with a developer count?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we intentionally tried to leave the kind of groundwork for development open. We wanted to make sure that we were investing in the things that make affordable housing development possible. So we fully intend these funds to be able to be used for infrastructure. And again, I think, in terms of working with a developer or, hiring a general contractor, like if whatever is necessary to get your project off the ground, we would consider to be an eligible use of the funds. We would also are really interested in making sure that these funds leverage other dollars. And so to the extent there are other programs that can pay for things, but these funds might, fill that final gap, that's really the intention.
Yeah, I think, something that we did talk about in terms of that priority of expanding capacity was to help organizations and local governments that were thinking about housing, or, thinking this through, to be able to do some of that pre-development work. you know, again, coming back to what Kathy was saying, you know, making sure all the while to have that COVID tieback is going to be a vital part of this process, and we don't know yet what that will look like in terms of, you know, who has to sign off, how the disproportionately impacted community is identified, but it's definitely something we talked about, and you know, pre-development costs are exorbitant and can sometimes inhibit projects moving forward. So anything that these funds could do in a one-time way to help projects move forward, I think we are trying to keep our eye on that ball.
Wonderful, thank you. So next question, will the modular housing funding apply to prefab panelized modular construction that is not manufactured or mobile homes?
So that specific proposal kind of came up during our conversation and was really aimed at filling a gap in need in the state that we have, well, one now modular factory and another sort of proof of concept in Pueblo that's kind of still being litmus tested. So this funding wouldn't necessarily go directly to other modular panelized housing. This is really aimed at creating the space, the literal space for modular to be developed in the state. Again, this proposal was structured as a forgivable loan, so I think it's going to undergo some revamping, retooling as the federal guidance is sort of brought to bear and on the proposals and recommendations that the task force made.
Awesome, thank you. Kathy, do you have anything to add before we go to the next question?
The only thing I will say is this was one of the governor's proposals, and so it is very likely that they have some specific ideas in mind for how these dollars will be spent, and more information to come, I think, as we start to see how the legislation gets drafted.
Wonderful, thanks. It looks like we just have one more question for you. It asks, on one of the first slides, it looked like under allowable uses of funds that most moves were for economic opportunities. That seems like it leaves seniors out who may no longer be working. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Trying to go back into my head. Oh.
I can swing back to and see if we can find what's going on.
You know, I think we definitely had our eyes on the needs of seniors through this process. We had a great representative from the AARP, Roberto Rey. So part of the idea around disproportionately impacted communities certainly incorporates, I think, seniors into it, and you know, we know that that's a unique population that has unique housing challenges, and so to the extent that in the recommendations that were made that those unique challenges can be addressed, I think I think that that's definitely something that our recommendations wanted to incorporate, and we definitely did keep those in mind as we were thinking about what we were recommending to the task force and the ultimate report that the task force issued.
And I'll just mention that the disproportionate impact on COVID can come in the form of an economic impact or a public health impact. So for communities where virus rates were high and deaths were high, like that's obviously a public health impact. But where, you know, businesses had to shut down and we have communities, you know, frontline working communities And you can demonstrate the economic impact, especially, you know, as we're just now kind of really getting everybody, you know, back to work in a more substantial way. And again, it's going to be up to the developers, I think, to make sure, or the people applying for the funds, to make sure that they're making that case to Division of Housing or to CHAFA if some of the funds flow through CHAFA. And I would say there's a lot of language in the federal guidance that says, you know, we recognize that many of the communities that were disproportionately impacted by COVID are many of the same communities who are facing significant housing challenges today and because of historical policies. And so to the extent that we can remedy both things at once, we should strive to do so.
Wonderful, thank you. It looks like that is all the questions that we've gotten so far. So we can go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I'm gonna turn my screen off now so that we can kind of wrap this up. We really appreciate your time. Kathy, Brian, thank you so much. This was great. For anyone who might still have questions, I've gone ahead and put Megan Dollar's email address in the chat as well. She's more than happy to answer any questions that might come up. Feel free to send those along to me as well. You'll be receiving follow-up information from me that will include a recording of this webinar as well as presentation materials. So again, any questions, send them our way. We really look forward to seeing you again at our next housing webinar. And again, Kathy, Brian, thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts before we kind of let everyone go?
No, I would just thank you for having us today. And maybe when you send out the recording materials, you can also send a link to the final Affordable Housing Transformational Task Force report.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just thank you for having us, and really thank you for all the work that you do. You all are on the front lines of a lot of issues, especially the housing issue. And so I'm grateful for your engagement and your attention to making affordable housing a priority and you know, making it happen and work in our communities. So
Thank you very much. Everyone, I hope you have a great day. Feel free to reach out if you need anything.
Thanks.
Thanks
Bye.
so much.
bye.